After a brutal car crash, a ruthless Arab millionaire has a near-death experience that changes everything. Khalid al-Mansour surveyed the city from the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, his gaze cool and calculating. The skyline of Dubai sparkled beneath the midday sun, a concrete and glass testament to ambition, wealth, and power, his power. Khalid had built his empire from the ground up, starting with a single risky investment in luxury real estate and expanding into high-end retail and hospitality. Every square meter of his holdings, every sleek tower bearing his company's logo, was a reminder of his unparalleled success. His wealth was immense, his influence undeniable. Yet, in the whispered conversations of business circles, he was referred to as the Desert Storm, a force of nature who left devastation in his wake. Ruthless and pragmatic, Khalid had a singular philosophy: success was for the strong, and the weak were meant to be left behind. It was this philosophy that had driven Khalid to where he stood today, but it was also what made him widely feared and deeply disliked. In his world, relationships were transactional, alliances were temporary, and loyalty was a myth. He relished his reputation. Being underestimated was a luxury he never afforded his competition. Today was another victory. Khalid's acquisition of a prime waterfront property had just been finalized, a multi-billion-dollar deal that would cement his dominance over the real estate market. The project's blueprint lay on his desk, a sprawling luxury resort that promised unparalleled opulence. But this triumph was built on ashes. The knock at the door was sharp, almost hesitant. Khalid's assistant, Farid, stepped in, his expression anxious. "Sir, there's a situation downstairs," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Khalid's brow furrowed. "Be specific." "There's a woman outside the building. She's holding a sign and causing a commotion." Annoyed, Khalid waved him off. "Tell security to handle it." Farid hesitated. "She's making some strong accusations, sir. She says she's here because of you." With a sigh of irritation, Khalid strode out of his office, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floors. By the time he reached the ground floor, a small crowd had gathered outside the towering glass entrance. The woman in question stood at the center, her face flushed with anger, a hand-painted sign clutched tightly in her grip. It read, "Khalid al-Mansour destroys families for profit." Her voice rang out, clear and unrelenting. "This man doesn't care about the lives he ruins. My bakery was my family's legacy, and he tore it down like it was nothing. My son." Khalid stepped forward, flanked by security guards. The crowd parted as his imposing presence drew closer. He looked at the woman with a mixture of disdain and detachment, the faintest hint of amusement curling his lips. "You are trespassing," he said, his tone calm but icy. "I suggest you leave before the authorities are called." The woman's defiance didn't waver. "You took everything from me," she spat. "My bakery stood for 30 years, feeding this community. My son needed medical care, and because of you, we couldn't afford it. He's—" Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "He's gone now. And you stand there like you've done nothing wrong." Khalid's expression didn't change. He had heard variations of this story before, angry accusations, pleas for understanding. It didn't move him. Business was business. Sentimentality had no place in it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But this is not my concern. Your property was compensated for according to market value. What you chose to do with that money is your responsibility." The woman's eyes blazed with fury. "You think you can keep walking over people and not face the consequences? One day, Khalid, you'll see. You'll see what kind of man you are." Khalid turned to leave, the crowd murmuring uneasily as he disappeared into the lobby. Farid trailed behind him nervously. "Sir, do you think this could—" "She's irrelevant." Khalid cut him off. "Focus on our priorities. The resort's groundbreaking is next week. Make sure there are no delays." Farid nodded, though his unease lingered. Khalid returned to his office, shutting the door with a sharp click. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the edge of his desk, brushing the incident from his mind. It was an unfortunate byproduct of success, he told himself. If people refused to adapt, they were destined to be left behind. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Khalid's driver, Yusef, waited at the base of the tower. The sleek black car gleamed under the streetlights, a symbol of wealth and precision. Yusef opened the door as Khalid approached. "Long day, sir?" Yusef asked as Khalid settled into the back seat. "Productive," Khalid replied, scrolling through emails on his phone. Yusef pulled into the flow of traffic, the city a blur of lights and motion. After a moment, he glanced at Khalid in the rearview mirror. "If I may, sir." Khalid raised an eyebrow, a signal for him to continue. "You work harder than anyone I know. But sometimes you must slow down. A man can't run at full speed forever." Khalid smirked, his eyes still fixed on his phone. "Yusef, I'm not like other men. I don't stop. I don't need to." Yusef didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Khalid dismissed the remark as the musings of someone who couldn't understand the drive it took to reach the top. As they merged onto the highway, Khalid's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was another potential investor, eager to discuss opportunities. He answered without hesitation, his voice sharp and commanding. The city stretched out before him, a testament to his ambition. But as the car sped through the night, weaving between traffic, Yusef's words lingered in the back of his mind like a faint echo. Unstoppable. For now. The faint echo of Yusef's words lingered in Khalid's mind as the car sped down the highway. He dismissed them as unnecessary noise. Slowing down wasn't in his vocabulary, and he prided himself on his relentless drive. The world didn't wait for the weak. Khalid believed this truth with unshakable conviction, and as the city lights blurred past the windows, his mind was already on the deal he was set to close, a game-changing acquisition that would make headlines. "Faster, Yusef," Khalid said sharply, glancing at his watch. "We can't afford delays." Yusef nodded silently, weaving the car through the late-night traffic. The roads were slick from a brief desert rain, a rarity that Khalid didn't bother to notice. His phone buzzed again, and he answered immediately, diving into a conversation about contract terms and projected profits. His voice was steady, commanding, a reflection of the control he wielded over every aspect of his life. But control was an illusion. The screech of tires cut through the conversation like a blade. Khalid barely had time to register Yusef's panicked shout before the car swerved violently. A truck, its headlights glaring like twin suns, barreled toward them. Yusef jerked the wheel, trying to avoid the collision, but the wet road betrayed them. The car spun, a helpless spiral of metal and momentum, and then the impact came, a deafening crash that obliterated everything. Khalid felt weightless, the world around him dissolving into chaos. Pain shot through his body, sharp and unforgiving, but it was fleeting. Darkness consumed him, cold and silent, and for the first time in years, Khalid felt small. Insignificant. Then came the light. It wasn't the harsh glare of hospital fluorescence, or the comforting warmth of the sun. It was otherworldly, soft yet piercing, pulling him from the void. Khalid opened his eyes, or something like that. He wasn't sure if his body was intact, or even present. All he knew was that he was no longer in the car, nor anywhere familiar. The ground beneath him was sand, endless and golden, stretching out in every direction. Above, the sky was an infinite expanse of pale blue, devoid of clouds or sun. The air was still, heavy with an uncanny silence. Khalid stood, or floated, uncertain of what held him upright. He tried to move, but his limbs felt detached, weightless. A figure appeared in the distance, emerging from the shimmering horizon. Robed in white, it moved with a grace that defied the laws of nature, gliding across the sand without leaving footprints. As it drew closer, Khalid could see that the figure's face was obscured by a shimmering veil, its features impossible to discern. "Where am I?" Khalid's voice echoed unnaturally, as though the desert itself absorbed and amplified his words. The figure stopped a few feet away, its presence both serene and commanding. When it spoke, its voice was layered, as if multiple beings were speaking in unison. "You are between worlds, Khalid al-Mansour. Neither alive nor dead, Khalid frowned, his mind reeling. This is a dream, he said firmly, though the words felt hollow. I'm in a hospital, unconscious. This isn't real. The figure tilted its head, a gesture that felt almost human. You have always believed you control your reality. That belief has brought you here. But now, the time has come for you to confront the truth. Before Khalid could respond, the desert around him began to shift. The sand rippled like water, rising and falling in waves. Khalid staggered, or the sensation of staggering filled him, struggling to maintain his balance. The ground solidified again, but it was no longer sand. He stood on the polished marble of his office floor, surrounded by the familiar walls of glass and steel. It was exactly as he had left it, down to the unopened files on his desk. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Khalid turned and froze. A woman stood in the corner of the office, her face partially hidden by shadows. It was the same woman from earlier that day, the one who had confronted him outside his building with accusations of ruin and loss. You, Khalid said, his voice laced with irritation. What is this? What are you doing here? The woman stepped forward, her features becoming clearer. Her face was etched with pain and anger, but there was something else in her eyes, a sadness that struck a chord Khalid didn't recognize. This is not about what I am doing here, Khalid, she said, her voice steady and haunting. It is about what you have done. The office dissolved, replaced by a cramped bakery. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee. Khalid blinked, disoriented. Behind the counter, the woman stood with a young boy, her son. The boy was pale, frail, his eyes too large for his face. He clung to her side as she worked tirelessly, her hands dusted with flour and exhaustion etched into her posture. This was my life, the woman said, her voice a whisper now. This was my joy. Until you came. Khalid watched, unable to look away, as the bakery vanished. In its place stood one of his gleaming towers, its shadow stretching over the empty lot where the bakery once stood. The boy's laughter faded into silence, replaced by the cold hum of machinery and the indifferent buzz of corporate life. I compensated you, Khalid said, though his words felt weak even to himself. The property was paid for. Money does not heal wounds, the woman replied. It does not bring back what is lost. The scene shifted again, faster this time, and Khalid found himself back in the desert. The robed figure stood before him, its presence more imposing now. These are the lives you have touched, Khalid, the figure said. You built your empire on their suffering. And there are more. The horizon began to fill with shapes, silhouettes of men, women, and children. They moved toward him, their faces becoming clearer with each step. Khalid recognized some immediately, the small business owners he had outbid, the families displaced by his developments, the partners he had betrayed. This is madness, Khalid said, his voice rising. You can't expect me to bear responsibility for everyone. I did what I had to do. It's business. The figure's voice remained calm, but its words carried weight. You must confront the truth of your actions. Only then can you decide what kind of man you wish to be. Before Khalid could protest, the desert began to dissolve, pulling him into a swirling void of light and shadow. He tried to fight it, but the force was overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the world went dark. Khalid floated in silence, his mind racing, his heart pounding. For the first time in his life, he felt something foreign, fear. Fear of what he might see next. Fear of what he might become. The darkness surrounded Khalid, heavy and suffocating. He struggled to make sense of what had just happened, the endless desert, the robed figure, and the sea of accusing faces that had stared at him, silently judging. It was all impossible, surreal, yet it felt vividly real. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady drumbeat of fear and confusion. Then, a faint light pierced the void. Khalid blinked, and suddenly he wasn't floating anymore. He was standing on a narrow street in the middle of a bustling neighborhood. The smells of spices and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the chatter of people. It was unmistakably familiar, an older part of Dubai that he had frequented in his youth. But something about it was different, frozen in time, as though he had stepped into a memory. Ahead of him, a modest bakery stood at the corner of the street. Its painted sign was faded but cheerful, and the smell of warm pastries wafted through the open windows. The scene tugged at a long-buried memory, though Khalid couldn't place it. Before he could move closer, the door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. It was Amal, the woman who had confronted him earlier. But she was different. Her face was calm, serene even, her features unburdened by the anger she had worn in life. Her eyes, however, held the weight of something deeper, grief, perhaps, or judgment. "Khalid," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "Do you recognize this place?" Khalid hesitated. "It's familiar. This was my bakery," Amal said, gesturing toward the building behind her. "This was my family's legacy. My father built it with his own hands, and when he passed, I poured everything I had into keeping it alive. This bakery was more than a business. It was our life." Khalid crossed his arms, instinctively defensive. "You were compensated for it. More than market value. I didn't force you to sell." Amal's expression didn't change. She stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "You didn't force me, Khalid, but you gave me no choice. When you announced your luxury project, the property taxes soared. The landlords in the area began selling off their buildings, and the community that supported my bakery started disappearing. You call it business, but it felt like a siege." Khalid opened his mouth to argue but found no words. The bustling scene around them began to shift, like a film being rewound. The streets grew emptier, the paint on the bakery sign peeled away, and the building's windows darkened. The air grew heavy, thick with silence. Khalid looked around, unease prickling at the back of his neck. The bakery door creaked open again, but this time, it wasn't Amal who stepped out. It was a boy, no older than 8, with dark circles under his eyes and a thin frame that spoke of hardship. He clutched a small cloth bag, his tiny hands trembling as he reached into it and pulled out a coin. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Mama," the boy said, looking up at Amal, "is this enough to buy medicine?" Khalid felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched Amal kneel before the boy, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Habibi," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We'll find another way. I promise." The boy's face crumpled, and he buried his head in her shoulder. Amal's arms wrapped tightly around him, as though she could shield him from the weight of their reality. The scene froze, and Amal turned back to Khalid, her eyes blazing. "Do you see now?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your towers cast shadows, Khalid. They took the light from our lives. My son, Samir, needed treatment, and we couldn't afford it. He grew weaker every day, until there was nothing left of him but the memories we clung to." Khalid looked away, the guilt gnawing at him. "I didn't know," he muttered. "I couldn't have known." "You didn't care to know," Amal shot back. "You think the world revolves around numbers and contracts. But your fortune is built on the ruins of others, Khalid. Every brick of your empire rests on the suffering you chose to ignore." The bakery began to crumble, the walls collapsing inward as the scene dissolved into darkness once more. Khalid found himself back in the desert, the robed figure standing where Amal had been moments ago. The sand beneath his feet felt colder now, unyielding. "You have seen the truth," the figure said, its voice layered and resonant. "Do you deny it?" Khalid clenched his fists, anger and shame warring within him. "What was I supposed to do?" he demanded. "I can't build success without making hard decisions. You make it sound like I'm the only one." "Perhaps," the figure replied. "But others acknowledge the cost of their actions. You have spent your life ignoring it." Khalid's voice faltered. He stopped, the words choking in his throat. The figure raised its hand, and the desert began to shift again. Shapes formed on the horizon, indistinct but growing clearer with each passing moment. Khalid's heart sank as he recognized the silhouettes, more people, more faces, each carrying a story, a wound inflicted by his ambition. "This is only the beginning," the figure said. "You must confront them all." Before Khalid could protest, the sands surged upward, enveloping him in a whirlwind of light and shadow. He closed his eyes, bracing himself against the storm, but the images of Amal and her son remained burned into his mind. When the storm subsided, Khalid found himself standing in another place, another memory waiting to unfold. The weight of what he had seen pressed heavily on his chest. For the first time, the cracks in his armor began to show. The desert was vast, but the journey ahead felt infinitely larger. The wind howled in Khalid's ears as the sands of the desert swallowed him. He shut his eyes against the blinding light and gritted his teeth, bracing himself for whatever came next. Amal's words echoed in his mind. "Your fortune is built on the ruins of others." The accusation clung to him, heavy and suffocating, but there was no time to process it. The storm of light and sand stilled, and Khalid felt himself solidify in a new place. When he opened his eyes, the desert was gone. He stood in an office, familiar yet strange. The furniture was simple, functional, and far removed from the opulence of his current world. Khalid recognized it immediately, his first office, shared with Ahmed. It was the space where his empire had begun. The room was frozen in time, a snapshot from the past. On the desk sat an old computer, stacks of paper cluttering its surface. A whiteboard filled with hastily sketched diagrams hung on the wall, and the faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. The scene tugged at a long-forgotten part of Khalid, a memory buried under years of ambition. A figure sat at the desk, hunched over a laptop. Khalid's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Ahmed, his former business partner and closest friend. Ahmed had been there from the beginning, his loyalty unwavering, until Khalid had thrown him aside. Ahmed looked up, his expression both weary and worn, yet his eyes burned with a fire Khalid had not seen in years. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Unlike Amal, there was no calmness in him. There was anger, raw and sharp, tempered only by the crushing weight of disappointment. "So," Ahmed said, his voice cutting through the silence. "We meet again." Khalid swallowed, his throat dry. "Ahmed," he began, but the words faltered. What could he possibly say to a man he had so thoroughly betrayed? "Don't bother," Ahmed said, waving a hand. "This isn't a reunion. This is a reckoning." The room around them began to shift, the walls fading away as though melting into air. Khalid now stood in the middle of a bustling conference room. He recognized the scene immediately. It was the meeting where he had forced Ahmed out of their company. The younger version of Khalid stood at the head of the table, commanding the room with the same confidence that had built his empire. Ahmed sat near the end, his expression dark and unreadable as Khalid unveiled his plans to buy out Ahmed's shares. "You didn't even look me in the eye," Ahmed said bitterly, watching the scene unfold. "You framed it as a business decision. You made it sound like you were doing me a favor. But you knew what it meant. You knew what you were taking from me." The younger Khalid's voice rang out, calculated and unyielding. "This is the best path forward for the company. Your shares will be bought at a generous valuation. It's a win-win." Ahmed in the memory clenched his fists under the table but said nothing. Khalid remembered the look on his face that day, wounded, betrayed. At the time, it had barely registered. He had told himself Ahmed would recover, that business was business. The scene dissolved again, replaced by a small, dimly lit apartment. Ahmed sat alone on a worn couch, his face buried in his hands. Unpaid bills littered the coffee table, alongside an empty bottle of medication. Khalid felt a pang in his chest as he realized what he was seeing. "This was my life after you took everything," Ahmed said, his voice breaking. "The buyout wasn't enough to start over. I had poured my soul into that company, and you stole it from me. You took my purpose, my stability, my dignity. Do you have any idea what that does to a man?" Khalid turned to face him, guilt clawing at his insides. "Ahmed, I didn't know. I thought you'd move on. That you'd build something else." Ahmed's laughter was bitter. "You didn't know because you didn't care to. I spiraled into depression, Khalid. I lost everything. And you? You didn't even glance back. You just kept climbing, stepping over everyone in your path. The apartment began to fade, and the two men were back in the desert. Ahmed stood tall, his gaze unwavering. His anger had softened, replaced by a profound sadness. You were my friend, Ahmed said, his voice heavy with emotion. I trusted you. We built that company together, but when it became inconvenient, you discarded me like I was nothing. Trust, Khalid, trust is the currency you've squandered. Not money, not power. Trust. Khalid's head dropped, shame coursing through him. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Ahmed stepped closer, his expression softening. It's not about fixing the past. It's about recognizing the damage and deciding if you'll keep causing it. The question isn't what you've done, Khalid. It's what you'll do now. The desert winds began to pick up again, swirling around them. Ahmed's figure started to blur, his edges dissolving like sand blown away by the breeze. Will you learn? Ahmed asked, his voice echoing as he disappeared into the storm. Or will you keep walking this path? Khalid stood alone in the desert, his mind racing. Amal's grief and Ahmed's betrayal weighed on him like stones. The people he had wronged weren't faceless anymore. They had names, stories, pain. And for the first time, Khalid couldn't hide behind the justification of business. The storm began to subside, and Khalid braced himself for what would come next. He knew there were more faces to confront, more truths to uncover. And with every step, the fortress he had built around his heart began to crumble. The storm eased, leaving Khalid alone in the quiet, unrelenting desert. His chest felt tight, weighed down by Amal's sorrow and Ahmed's anger. Their words clung to him like invisible chains, dragging him deeper into guilt. He tried to rationalize it, tried to remind himself that ambition required sacrifice, but the justifications no longer held. The faces of those he had wronged wouldn't let him forget. The air grew colder, a biting chill sweeping through the desert. The horizon shimmered, and Khalid felt his stomach knot. He wasn't sure what awaited him next, but a sinking feeling told him it would cut even deeper. As the shimmering grew closer, the desert shifted again, and Khalid found himself standing in a small, sunlit courtyard. The smell of jasmine flowers filled the air, and the laughter of children echoed faintly. He recognized the place immediately. It was the family home where he had spent his childhood, a place of warmth and safety, untouched by the cold calculus of business. But it wasn't as he remembered. The house stood still and silent, its once bright walls faded with neglect. Khalid's breath caught as he stepped closer, his footsteps heavy against the cobblestones. The laughter had faded, replaced by a heavy, aching silence. A figure stood in the doorway. She was young, with a delicate frame, her hair tucked beneath a scarf. Her face was achingly familiar, though Khalid hadn't seen it in years. Aisha, he whispered, his voice breaking. His younger sister turned toward him, her smile faint but sad. Khalid, she said softly. It's been a long time. Khalid's heart clenched. He had lost Aisha years ago to an illness that had stolen her too soon. The pain of her death had been a shadow he rarely let himself confront, burying it beneath the demands of his empire. And now here she was, standing before him, her eyes filled with both warmth and quiet reproach. I've missed you, Khalid said, his voice trembling. I didn't mean to forget me? Aisha interrupted gently, her gaze unwavering. No, I don't think you meant to. But you did. The courtyard began to change, the bright sunlight dimming. Khalid found himself inside a modest bedroom. Aisha sat on the edge of the bed, her figure frail, her complexion pale. The room was sparse, save for a few personal items, a framed photo of their family, a stack of books, and a letter she held in her trembling hands. This was the end for me, Aisha said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. When I needed you the most, Khalid, you weren't there. Khalid opened his mouth to protest, but the scene began to move, playing out as if he weren't standing there at all. He watched as Aisha unfolded the letter, her fingers shaking. Her voice, soft and strained, filled the room as she read aloud. "Dear Khalid," she began, her words faltering. "I hope this letter finds you well. I know how busy you are, how much you've accomplished. You've always been so driven, so determined. I admire you for that. But I need you now. I'm scared, Khalid. The doctors say it's worse than they thought, and I don't know how much time I have left. I don't want to face this alone." Her voice broke, and she pressed the letter to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Khalid felt his knees weaken as he watched the scene unfold. He remembered that letter, he had received it, but it had arrived on the same day as a critical business deal. He had skimmed it, made a mental note to call Aisha later, and then forgotten about it entirely. By the time he remembered, it had been too late. "I didn't know," Khalid whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I didn't mean to ignore you. I thought there would be time." Aisha turned to him, her expression unreadable. "There's never enough time, Khalid. You were so focused on building your empire, on chasing something bigger, that you forgot the people who loved you most. I wasn't the only one." The room began to shift again. Khalid now stood in the same house, but years earlier. Their parents were seated at the dining table, their faces worn with worry. He saw himself in the memory, younger but already consumed by ambition. His mother spoke, her voice tinged with hurt. "Khalid, we barely see you anymore," she said. "You've missed so many family gatherings. It's like you're a stranger." "I'm busy, Mama," the younger Khalid replied, barely looking up from his phone. "You know how much work it takes to succeed. I'm doing this for all of us." "For us?" his father asked, his tone skeptical. "Or for yourself?" The memory froze, and Aisha stepped forward, her expression softer now. "They were proud of you, Khalid. We all were. But they missed you. I miss you. Success meant nothing to them if it meant losing you in the process." Khalid felt a lump rise in his throat. He had told himself he was building a better life for his family, but the truth was unavoidable. He had used that justification to avoid the guilt of his choices, to excuse his absence. Aisha placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. "Your success has come at the cost of love, Khalid. Do you understand that now?" Khalid nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I should have been there. For you, for all of you." It's not too late," Aisha said gently, cutting him off. "But you have to make a choice. You can't change the past, but you can decide what kind of future you want." The courtyard began to dissolve, the jasmine flowers wilting as the scene faded. Aisha's figure grew faint, her voice echoing as the desert returned. "Remember this, Khalid," she said, her tone both tender and firm. "Love is the only legacy that truly matters." And then she was gone. Khalid sank to his knees in the sand, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Amal's grief, Ahmed's betrayal, Aisha's loss, they were all threads of the same truth. His ambition had blinded him, leading him to prioritize wealth over the very people who had once been his foundation. The desert wind stirred again, signaling another shift. Khalid wiped his face, his heart heavy but resolute. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he couldn't turn away. Not anymore. The wind howled as the desert faded, the swirling sand giving way to darkness. Khalid felt a sudden jolt, as though he were being pulled upward through a narrow tunnel, and then everything stilled. The cold, oppressive weight of the visions hung over him, a suffocating reminder of all he had seen. Amal's pain, Ahmed's anger, Aisha's sorrow, they were etched into his mind, unrelenting and vivid. A sharp, rhythmic beeping pulled him from the void. Khalid's eyes fluttered open, his vision blurred. The sterile white of a hospital room came into focus, the steady hum of machines filling the air. Pain radiated through his body, though it felt distant, overshadowed by the turmoil within his mind. He turned his head slowly, the effort almost too much. A nurse stood nearby, adjusting an IV. She noticed his movement and gasped softly, hurrying to his bedside. "Mr. Al-Mansour," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and surprise. "You're awake." Khalid blinked at her, disoriented. His mouth felt dry, and his throat ached when he tried to speak. The nurse poured a glass of water, helping him sip. The cool liquid brought some clarity, though it did little to quiet the storm inside him. "How long?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You've been unconscious for 3 days," the nurse replied gently. "The accident, it was serious. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. The word felt hollow. Khalid closed his eyes, the images of the visions flashing behind his eyelids. He wasn't sure if he felt lucky. The guilt was too heavy, the memories too raw. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped in. Yusef, his driver, looked pale and shaken, his usual composure replaced by worry. He rushed to Khalid's side. "Sir," Yusef said, his voice trembling. "Thank God you're awake. I thought we'd lost you." Khalid forced a weak smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm still here," he murmured. "But I'm not sure who that is anymore." Yusef frowned but said nothing, sensing Khalid's need for silence. The nurse excused herself, leaving them alone. Khalid stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the words of the spirits. Amal's accusation, Ahmed's disappointment, Aisha's heartbreak, they weighed on him, each one a blade cutting through his carefully constructed armor. The door opened again, this time admitting a trio of men in suits. Khalid recognized them immediately, his top executives, the men who managed the day-to-day operations of his empire. Their expressions were grave, though Khalid could see the calculation in their eyes. "Mr. Al-Mansour," the eldest of them, Hassan, began, his tone brisk. "We're relieved to see you recovering. But there's an urgent matter that requires your attention." Khalid raised an eyebrow, though the movement sent a jolt of pain through his head. "I just woke up from a near-death experience," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Surely it can wait." "It's the waterfront project," Hassan said, ignoring the rebuke. "There's been backlash. The media is picking up stories about displaced families and unethical practices. The public sentiment is turning against us." Khalid's stomach churned. The waterfront project, the deal he had been rushing to close when the accident happened. It had been another step toward solidifying his empire, but now it felt tainted, its success built on the suffering of others. He thought of Amal, her grief and anger still fresh in his mind. "And?" Khalid asked, though he dreaded the answer. Hassan exchanged a glance with the others. "We need to respond quickly. A show of strength. If we back down or acknowledge fault, it will set a dangerous precedent. Investors are already nervous. We have to stay the course." Stay the course. The words felt like chains, dragging Khalid back into the ruthless world he had built. He looked at Hassan, then at the others, their faces expectant and cold. They were waiting for him to be the man they knew, the man who made hard decisions without flinching. But Khalid wasn't sure he could be that man anymore. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice low but firm. Hassan frowned. "With respect, sir, time is not a luxury we have. The board is expecting your direction by the end of the day." Khalid waved them off, his patience wearing thin. "Then they'll wait. Now leave me." The executives hesitated, clearly unhappy, but they obeyed. The door closed behind them, and Khalid sank deeper into the hospital bed. His head throbbed, a mix of physical pain and the weight of his inner conflict. Yusef stepped closer, his expression cautious. "Sir, if I may, are you all right? You seem different." Khalid let out a hollow laugh. "Different? I'm not sure what I am anymore, Yusef. Everything I've done, everything I've built, it feels like a lie." Yusef tilted his head, his brow furrowed. "With respect, sir, you've built an empire. That's not a lie. It's an achievement." "An achievement," Khalid repeated bitterly. "At what cost? I've hurt people, Yusef. People who trusted me, who depended on me. And for what? A bigger tower? A larger profit margin?" Yusef hesitated, then placed a steady hand on Khalid's shoulder. "You've always said success requires hard decisions. Maybe it's time to decide what success means to you now." Khalid closed his eyes, Yusuf's words echoing in his mind. What did success mean now? Was it the empire he had built, or was it something he had lost along the way? Amal's grief, Ahmed's betrayal, Aisha's heartbreak, they weren't just memories. They were truths stripped of the justifications he had used to shield himself. He thought of the waterfront project, of the families it would displace, of the community it would erase. He thought of his board, their cold insistence on profit above all else. And he thought of Aisha, her final words ringing in his ears. Love is the only legacy that truly matters. The conflict within him deepened, pulling him in two directions. On one side was the life he had known, the ruthless pursuit of power and wealth that had defined him. On the other was an unfamiliar path, one that required sacrifice, vulnerability, and change. For the first time in his life, Khalid didn't know which path to take. But he knew he couldn't stay in the middle forever. Khalid sat in his hospital bed, staring at the sunlight streaming through the window. It had been weeks since the accident, and his body was healing, but his mind remained heavy with the weight of his revelations. The faces of Amal, Ahmed, and Aisha haunted him, their words carving deep into his conscience. Each spirit had shown him a version of himself he could no longer ignore. The executives had continued pressuring him about the waterfront project, their warnings about investor confidence ringing in his ears. But Khalid had stopped responding to their calls. For the first time, the endless demands of his empire seemed trivial. He had made his decision. The first step was Amal. With help from Yusuf, Khalid tracked down the bakery she had once owned. The space had been converted into a luxury cafe, its minimalist design a stark contrast to the warmth he had glimpsed in the visions. Khalid stood outside, his reflection distorted in the glass windows, and hesitated. This was unfamiliar territory. He wasn't used to asking for forgiveness. Inside, he found Amal seated at a small table, her back straight, her face cautious but composed. She had agreed to meet him after receiving his letter, though her skepticism was clear in her curt response. Khalid al-Mansour, she said as he approached, her tone neutral. To what do I owe the honor? Khalid sat across from her, his usual confidence replaced with something rawer. Amal, I came to apologize. For everything. She raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. You're sorry now? After all these years? I know words aren't enough. Khalid admitted, his voice steady but subdued. I can't undo the damage I caused. But I want to make things right. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents outlining a plan to fund the reopening of her bakery, complete with resources for her to hire a full team and a fund for community outreach programs. Amal's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her composure cracking. And your son? Khalid added quietly. I know it's too late to help him, but I've started a medical assistance program in his name. It will cover expenses for families who can't afford care. It's the least I can do. Amal's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained firm. You can't bring him back, Khalid. Nothing will ever bring him back. I know, Khalid said, his throat tight. But I want to honor him. And I want to honor you. Amal studied him for a long moment, then nodded. This doesn't erase what happened. But maybe it's a start. The next step was Ahmed. Khalid found him living in a modest apartment, far from the luxury they had once dreamed of building together. When Ahmed opened the door, his surprise quickly turned to suspicion. What do you want, Khalid? Ahmed asked, his tone sharp. Haven't you taken enough? I came to give something back, Khalid replied. He held out another folder, this one detailing a new venture, a project designed to uplift small businesses and entrepreneurs. He had reserved a stake in the venture for Ahmed, complete with full creative control and an equity share. Ahmed stared at the documents, then at Khalid. Why now? After all these years? Because I was wrong, Khalid said simply. I took everything from you, Ahmed. And I want to give you the chance to build something new. Ahmed's laugh was bitter. And you think money will fix it? No, Khalid said, his voice steady. But it's a start. You were my friend, Ahmed. I want to earn that back. If you'll let me. Ahmed's anger softened, though skepticism lingered in his eyes. This isn't going to undo what happened. But maybe it's enough to move forward. The most difficult step was reconnecting with his family. Khalid visited his parents' home for the first time in years, his heart heavy with memories of Aisha. The house was smaller than he remembered, but the warmth of his mother's cooking and his father's quiet presence filled the space with a familiarity he had forgotten. His mother's eyes widened when she saw him at the door. Khalid, she whispered, her voice wavering. You're here. I should have come sooner, Khalid said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry, Mama. His father remained silent but placed a hand on Khalid's shoulder, his touch firm and forgiving. The reunion was bittersweet, a reminder of the years Khalid had lost to his ambition. He shared stories of Aisha, his voice breaking as he recounted her final words. To honor her memory, Khalid announced the creation of the Aisha Foundation, dedicated to supporting underprivileged children with education and healthcare. The foundation was met with an outpouring of support, though Khalid made no effort to attach his name to it. This wasn't about his reputation, it was about making a difference. But not everyone supported Khalid's transformation. Within weeks, whispers of dissent began spreading among his executives and board members. They saw his philanthropy and new direction as signs of weakness, accusing him of neglecting the company's core mission. Hassan confronted him during a tense meeting. You're destroying everything we built, Hassan said, his tone harsh. The waterfront project, the partnerships, it's all falling apart because you've gone soft. Khalid met his gaze, unflinching. If building this empire means destroying lives, then it's not worth it. Hassan scoffed. And what happens when the investors pull out? When the profits dry up? Are you ready to lose everything? Khalid leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. If that's the price of doing what's right, so be it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Khalid knew he was risking everything, his fortune, his reputation, his legacy. But for the first time, he felt at peace with his choices. The resistance didn't end there. Media outlets speculated about his motivations, accusing him of using philanthropy as a public relations strategy. Former allies distanced themselves, and lucrative deals slipped through his fingers. Khalid faced the fallout with quiet resolve, knowing he was on the path he needed to walk. For the first time in years, Khalid felt lighter. The burden of his ambition no longer weighed him down, replaced by a sense of purpose he had never known. Amal's bakery reopened, Ahmed's venture flourished, and the Aisha Foundation became a beacon of hope for countless families. Khalid's empire was changing, and so was he. The road ahead was uncertain, but he embraced it, ready to rebuild not just his business, but himself. For the first time, Khalid was building a legacy that mattered. The whispers of dissent among Khalid's executives and the rumblings of his board reached their peak in a critical meeting a month later. The air in the conference room was tense, charged with the weight of what was about to unfold. Khalid sat at the head of the table, his posture calm but resolute. Across from him, Hassan stood with a stack of documents, his expression a mixture of frustration and determination. This is it, Khalid, Hassan said, sliding the folder toward him. The Golden Crescent Project. $1 billion deal. The investors are ready to move forward, but we need your approval. Khalid opened the folder, scanning the plans. The project promised a sprawling complex of luxury apartments, high-end retail stores, and elite dining experiences. On paper, it was flawless, another jewel in the crown of his empire. But the location stopped him cold, an older district filled with low-income families, small businesses, and a vibrant community that had thrived there for generations. They'll be compensated, Hassan added, anticipating Khalid's hesitation. Above market value. We've ensured that everything is legal and by the book. Khalid closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. His mind raced with memories of Amal's bakery, Ahmed's despair, Aisha's letter. This wasn't just another deal. It was a test, a final opportunity to choose between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. And what happens to the families? Khalid asked, his voice steady. Where do they go after we demolish their homes and businesses? Hassan blinked, clearly taken aback. That's not our responsibility. We're offering them generous payouts. What they do after that is up to them. The room fell silent, all eyes on Khalid. He looked around at the faces of his executives, men and women who had once admired his ruthless drive. Now, their expressions ranged from confusion to impatience. They didn't understand. They couldn't. I won't approve it, Khalid said firmly. A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Hassan's face darkened, his composure cracking. You can't be serious, he said. Do you realize what's at stake? The board, the investors, they'll see this as a betrayal. Khalid met his gaze, unflinching. Let them. This isn't just about you, Hassan snapped. The company, the employees, everything we've built, it's all on the line. Khalid stood, his voice calm but resolute. Everything we've built has come at a cost I'm no longer willing to pay. If this company can't succeed without destroying lives, then it doesn't deserve to succeed. Hassan shook his head, his disbelief evident. You're throwing it all away. No, Khalid said quietly. I'm saving what matters. He walked out of the meeting, leaving the murmurs of dissent and anger behind. The decision would ripple through the company, shaking its foundations. Investors would pull out, deals would collapse, and Khalid's fortune would take a significant hit. But he felt no regret. For the first time in years, he knew he had done the right thing. In the weeks that followed, Khalid began transforming his business. Projects like the Golden Crescent were shelved indefinitely, replaced by initiatives aimed at revitalizing communities instead of displacing them. His remaining wealth was redirected toward ethical ventures, funding affordable housing, sustainable development, and education programs. The backlash was fierce. Former allies distanced themselves, media outlets criticized his choices, and the board attempted to stage a coup to remove him. But Khalid stood firm, weathering the storm with quiet determination. He wasn't trying to salvage his reputation or his fortune. He was building something greater. The changes in his life weren't limited to business. Khalid's relationships deepened in ways he hadn't anticipated. Amal's bakery flourished, becoming a hub for the community once again. She invited Khalid to the grand reopening, where she introduced him to her patrons as the man who had made it possible. The gratitude in their eyes filled a void Khalid hadn't realized existed. Ahmed's venture grew steadily, and their partnership began to heal old wounds. It wasn't an easy process, trust took time, but Khalid valued every small step forward. They shared ideas, debated strategies, and for the first time in years, Khalid felt like he had a true collaborator. His family, too, became a source of solace and joy. Khalid spent more time with his parents, sharing meals, stories, and quiet moments that felt like balm to his soul. The Aisha Foundation blossomed, helping hundreds of children in need. Every success reminded Khalid of his sister's unwavering love and the legacy she had left behind. One evening, as Khalid walked through a bustling street in the district he had once planned to demolish, he felt a strange sense of peace. The community was alive with laughter, music, and the scent of food from small vendors lining the sidewalks. Children played in the open spaces he had helped preserve, their joy untainted by the struggles their parents had faced. A faint breeze swept through the street, carrying with it a feeling of something familiar. Khalid stopped, turning toward a small park where the jasmine flowers were in full bloom. He thought of Aisha, of Amal, of Ahmed, and of the robed figure who had guided him through the desert of his soul. And then he saw them. The spirits appeared briefly, their forms faint but unmistakable. Amal's gentle strength, Ahmed's quiet resilience, and Aisha's radiant warmth. They didn't speak, but their presence was enough. Khalid felt their affirmation, their understanding, and their forgiveness. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Khalid alone with the bustling life around him. But he no longer felt alone. The emptiness that had driven him for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. Khalid walked on, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it. For the first time, he was living not for his ambition, but for the people whose lives he could touch. And in their joy, he found his redemption. Khalid's journey had brought him full circle, from a man consumed by ambition to one humbled by the impact of his choices. The wealth he had once wielded like a shield now served as a tool to uplift others, and the relationships he had neglected became the foundation of his new life. In choosing love and compassion over power, Khalid found the peace he had sought all along. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the legacy you're building. Are your choices uplifting others or leaving them behind? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's inspire each other to create a world where success is measured by the lives we touch. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge and uplift.